Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the 2022 Legal Leaders in MENA report. Today's launch will provide us with a unique insight and perspective from our esteemed panel. I want to take this opportunity to thank Richard Dean and our panel for being here today. I certainly look forward to listening to your conversation. At this point, I want to provide some background into why we commissioned this report. The last 2 years, as you probably agree, challenged us not only as a society, but also as a business and legal community. During this time, I noticed law firms demonstrating a unique resilience. We rolled out our sleeves and got back to work. And of course, there were changes to how we work, interact and collaborate with not only each other, but also with our clients. As a firm, we took stock of our journey and decided in the second half of 2021, it was time to capture insight of where we are at as a legal community. We wanted to understand from the region's legal decision makers their strategic priorities, investment objectives, risk and compliance, and how they see technology playing. With this in mind, we commissioned the Legal Leaders in MENA report. I'm proud to say the report captured the views of some 700 legal decision makers operating across 9 countries and 13 industry sectors in our markets. We've been diligent and thorough in a bid to deliver a report that has its fingers on the pulse of the legal community. This brings us to the launch. Our panelists will kickstart the conversation today. However, I would urge that as a legal community, we continue the dialogue, work closer with each other, interact more, and incorporate a more connected approach. This will help not only us, but our clients make sense of the increasingly sophisticated requirements of doing business in our region. At this point, I want to take a moment to recognize the significant efforts my colleagues at Al-Tamimi & Company had put into producing this report. They spent the last year working on this report, and I want to thank them for producing what I consider an excellent, insightful, and unique report. To our panelists, thank you for not only your participation today, but also for your ongoing support of the Legal Leaders in MENA report. Finally, I look forward to continuing the conversation with you after the launch of our report. And now, without further ado, I will hand over to Richard Dean to get the conversation started.
Sana, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's dive into the detail and 7 key themes in this report. First of all, legal enters the boardroom as decision makers. You've got ESG really rising up the legal agenda. Legal teams under the spotlight at the moment. The regulatory environment, it does need decoding. That's what we're hearing. You've got COVID, but it failed to deter investment. You've got Africa, massive focus on Africa as a continent in terms of investment. And finally, technology and innovation as drivers of growth. Let's get started. So let's meet our legal experts. First of all, to my right, Mona Mahdi from Henkel. Mona, tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you. My name is Mona Mahdi. I am a U.S. qualified attorney. I'm currently legal director, head of legal and compliance with Henkel for the India, Middle East, and Africa region. I spent the first half of my career in private practice, primarily in corporate commercial and intellectual property law. And then I moved in-house with Unilever for about 12 years before moving to Henkel.
Thanks very much indeed, Mona. Great to have you with us. Then we have Arturo with us today. Arturo Ortiz de Zarate is with IBM.
Thanks so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure being with you today. Arturo Ortiz de Zarate. It's not an easy last name to pronounce, but you got it exactly right. I was born and raised in Mexico. I am currently the general counsel for IBM in the Middle East and Africa region. We currently conduct business and we have operation in around 68 countries in the region. Before being here, which by the way, I just landed in Dubai 7 months into this role. I was the general counsel for IBM in Latin America, which I had responsibility over all IBM's line of business across the region.
Thank you very much indeed. And then in the middle, we have, I guess in some ways, our host today. Isabella is with us, Isabella Zadkowska, a partner here at Al-Tamimi.
I'm very happy to be here with all those great panelists and with you today. I'm a corporate structuring partner with Altamimi and Company. I've been practicing law mainly in private practice over 18 years. I look after clients, corporate clients, family businesses, huge conglomerates, so a variety of things, but normally in the corporate structuring domain.
Good to have you with us. Thanks very much indeed for hosting us today. Representing the education sector, we have Jake Barnard with GEMS Education.
Thanks, Richard. Really pleased to be here, and thanks to Altamy for having us. I'm the Group General Counsel for GEMS Education. We're headquartered here in Dubai. We have about 50 schools. I've been with GEMS for about 7 years, and I'm originally from the US and qualified in the US.
And finally, from the financial services sector, real pleasure to have with us Fozia Kehar from Citibank.
Thank you very much. I am the Regional General Counsel for Citi, covering Middle East and North Africa. That's about 17 jurisdictions. I've been with Citi for over 16 years. I've been a lawyer for far longer. I won't tell you how long. And I hail from Pakistan. And I've been here in Dubai, stationed here, for the last, a little over 13 years. So started in Pakistan and moved across with Citi to Dubai.
Fozia and all the panelists, it's great to have you with us. Thanks very much indeed. We've got about 40 minutes to dig into some of the issues that this report has unearthed. And Fozia, I'm going to start with you. And the issue of ESG, which came up so prominently in the report. 94% of legal decision makers regularly assess ESG risk and compliance within their role. So my question is this: is it really rising up the legal agenda, or is it just a trendy buzzword?
A trendy buzzword. No longer is it that. Regulators and policymakers across the board are now wisening up to the fact that this is going to be here to stay. Many companies have now issued across reports on their contribution towards ESG. Citi is one of them. We have a report that's come out very, very recently. In fact, clients of ours are now asking for ESG solutions, and banks tend to be helping them through with those as well. And ESG is not just the risks around environment, etc. It's also to do with the governance. It's to do with diversity, equity, inclusion. There's so many different aspects to it, and so no, it's here to stay for sure.
So, Mona, a similar question to you. Now, I can't imagine you're going to say, no, ESG is irrelevant, we don't even think about it. I'm sure you do. But specifically, as it impacts your world at Henkel, give us a couple of examples. How is it impacting what you do?
Sure. I think, if we look at the FMCG industry in general, I think it's become a non-negotiable. It's no longer a nice to have on all fronts when you look at, the different components of ESG. So when we talk about sustainability, it's at the forefront in the industry. So if we look at Henkel, for example, we support, we have goals supporting sustainability in terms of circular and net zero future for the organization. So things like circular use of water and production waste, eco-friendly packaging, even in the offices, the reduction of the use in single-use plastics. And then also on the social front, we look at how we can help support, thrive the communities in which we operate across various fronts. So education, well-being, various fronts like that. And of course, as Fozia mentioned, diversity, equity, and inclusion are very important. So one of the goals that we have is to reach gender parity across all management levels by 2025. And then, of course, post-pandemic, one of the areas that's also come to the forefront when we look at the impact of the pandemic across our people within the organization is mental health and well-being, and focusing on that as well. And then, overarching all of that, of course, is a very strong governance framework and the importance of that.
Just a quick follow-up question, Fozia, for you and for Mona. In terms of the legal compliance with ESG, both of you cover extensive regions and very diverse regions, and each will have its own legal requirements and codes of conduct, and they will be coming out even more over the next couple of years. Mona and then Fozia, how do you manage that from a legal compliance perspective when it comes to ESG?
You know, this region is very diverse in terms of the different types of jurisdictions in which we operate and the local challenges, regulatory, market practices, that sort of thing. So I think we have to look outwards as well to the partners that we choose in those jurisdictions, all the way down the supply chain line, for example, to ensure that, who we partner with, where we source from, et cetera, have the same types of code of ethics and principles by which we operate, and that theirs are in line with ours.
And Fozia, from you, what are the challenges you face from a legal perspective or a compliance perspective operating in so many different countries, all with broadly similar legislations, but all slightly different?
No, I'd second everything Mona said, of course, but for us, the message starts from the top of the house. And you'd agree that other countries, across the board, I'm not talking just about MENA, but beyond MENA, there's a lot of development that's happened on the ESG front. MENA, thus far, in terms of what I've seen, to make ESG, an absolute agenda in terms of their financial reports, in terms of whatever's happening around them, and the way they do business, essentially. And I think, again, to Mona's point, it's who we partner with. It's firms such as yourselves at Al-Tamimi. It's other concerns across the board that we rely on heavily to keep us sort of alert in terms of the regulatory developments that are coming up.
I think most companies are going to need to be ahead of regulation. It's one of the few areas where I think your other stakeholders are going to demand that you're ahead of regulation. You got investment funds that won't invest in you if you don't have an ESG agenda. It's not regulatory driven. I know for us, we've got a lot of young kids that are really, really conscious about environmental stuff. They learn this in schools. They're going to look at you as an organization. What are you doing? You're doing your part. So I feel from the top with investors and from the bottom with customers, they're going to demand more than you. Then I think regulation can keep up.
So Isabella, as a couple of people have mentioned, they turn to firms like yours, often these guys, for advice and guidance. But the regulatory or the legislative landscape is changing so fast. The report revealed that more than half, 51%, of the legal decision makers, like these guys, believe sudden changes to regulatory policy is a key challenge within their role. And they pick up the phone to you when that happens. One example, you've identified the UAE issuing 40 new laws at the end of last year. So my question is this: what impact does this have on business processes, and how do you, as a legal advisor, approach this?
In fact, that's a very broad topic, I think. And in the context of that question, immediately two things come to mind. That the number of the legislation that we've seen lately in the UAE is a very positive development. It's a very good indicator of the authorities realizing how much has been changing in the business environment, and that the world that we live in, our 2022, is a very fast-moving animal, if you like, in comparison to decades ago, when legislation was, of course, amended by jurisprudence, but that really didn't have to happen at the same pace that is happening today. But the changes do pose a challenge. On one hand, as a legal practitioner, I would say, okay, part of our profession is making sure that we're on top of the changes. When we enter the profession, we know that there will be changes, and it's our responsibility as legal practitioners to keep ourselves up to date. But practically, as human beings, with those 40 new pieces of legislation, of course, it becomes a challenge. And it's a challenge twofold, I would say. First of all, for us, in-house meaning in our private practice roles, where we have our teams and respective expert lawyers. What the number of new legislation has actually meant for us is that we have to specialize very narrowly as legal practitioners to make sure that in our respective areas of expertise, we really follow all the changes that happen. So we've got dedicated lawyers who look into those specific changes of law and who become experts in their narrow areas. So there is much more narrowing of areas of speciality. On the other hand, there is a challenge that we face in terms of communicating those changes to our clients, to Fuzia, to Jake, to Mona, or to Arturo. Because then with all those changes, we know, okay, on one hand, we want to make sure our clients are up to date with the changes, but up to date with the changes that concern their businesses. We don't want to bombard our clients with communication just for the sake of it, because then each of the lawyers practicing in-house would be getting so much communication on a daily basis. So again, and then to filter that communication well, we also have systems internally within our firm where we actually check the client sector of operation, the geographical coverage by the client business. So we would say, okay, well, where would Henkel have presence throughout the region where actually those changes are happening, right? So that's how we would then approach the huge number of new legislation being enacted.
So Arturo, from your perspective, I guess it's a two-part question. Firstly, you arrived here late last year and suddenly you're hit with 40 new laws in one country alone. I mean, how did you react to that? But secondly, in terms of turning to legal consultants for subject matter expertise, how do you approach that when things are changing so quickly?
Exactly. And I think Isabella touched on a very important topic, right? On a very important point. I mean, when I opened the newspaper, I walked into the office one of these mornings and I saw headlines in the newspapers, 40 new laws enacted in the UAE. I almost fainted, right? I mean, this is something that, it doesn't happen in other parts of the world, or at least you are engaged in some of the, discussions before this legislation makes it out of Congress, right? So I remember going to my desk, opening the newspaper and going through all the set of new regulations. And I did what, Isabel just did. It's like, I started focusing on which of these set of legislations is going to affect my business. So all of this, 28, 30, I may put it to the side. I may devote some time after to see what the impact this is going to have on my business or potentially my clients, right? Because we engage also with companies in our business. But you centralize on the 2, 3, or 4 pieces of legislation that are actually going to affect your impact immediately. And then you start getting the set of experts, right? To decide how you're going to react to this. For example, taking as an example, the labor law, right? We definitely immediately got in contact with Altamimi to say, look, you know our operations, you know how we do business. Can you give us an assessment on how this is going to impact our business? But of course, you also have to get your other stakeholders. You need to get in touch with human resources. You get in touch with finance. And then at the end, you have to make decisions very quickly, right? And I think this is when having a good network of colleagues in the region, solid support from outside counsel, and then you just exercise the judgment and you take the decision because you're given a very short time to react. So that has been, my experience so far with the, fast-paced environment that you're seeing in the region.
If I could just add to that, so that could be a bit of an ask, right? Just to be able to get a bit of lead time as you go about implementing the regulation. And of course, also getting a chance to participate in consultation around a proposed legislation, which doesn't always happen. And even if it does happen, I've seen that we don't always see the changes that are being proposed or the suggestions that are being made actually making their way back to the regulation, in that it still comes out perhaps in the same way that it was set out to be.
And I think to Fauzia's point, if I look at the FMCG industry that I've been in for quite a few years now, we do sometimes find ourselves with a surprise piece of regulation or decree that starts out in one jurisdiction and then, spreads to surrounding jurisdictions where you don't really have advance warning. All of a sudden, it's effective immediately, and you find that it ends up hindering your production almost immediately with an inability to do business. So you have to firefight, deal with the immediate issue, and then in parallel, try to understand what was the root cause of that regulation coming out or that rule coming out. It could be in relation to raw materials, for example. And then sometimes you find that perhaps the root is maybe some lack of awareness or misinformation. So then you work on that front as well in terms of raising awareness and educating and hoping to mitigate the situation and have a follow-up to that initial piece of regulation.
So Isabella, if I can just ask a very quick selfish question as a journalist, a radio and TV presenter. The question we often get from our listeners and viewers, who are often people like you, they're business owners or business managers, and you'll get a new piece of legislation come out, like you say, in the newspaper. We had one recently about employment insurance or unemployment insurance. And so many questions, and we're getting questions. And so my producers will say, right, let's pick up the phone and get a lawyer from Al Tamimi on the show tomorrow morning to answer these questions. But all you've had initially is the same piece in the newspaper that everyone else has read. The detail comes sometime later on. So how do you manage that process with your clients when they've got so many questions and you literally don't know because you haven't got the full legislation? It hasn't been gazetted, for example.
Yes. Yes, and that's a very good practical question. We get ourselves into that situation pretty often. And then with clients, what we would do is, of course, we discuss the legislation with them. We mention how we believe the legislation will be interpreted based on our experience with the authorities, within the given legislative framework. Oftentimes, myself or my colleagues are involved with authorities in the process of drafting the legislation or even the consultation papers. And then that gives us a little bit more background to what drove the legislation, what approach the authorities may take in enacting the legislation and then maybe enforcing them. Then even if there are no penalties imposed by the legislation for the breach of certain legal provisions, we then are able to brainstorm with clients what we believe could be the practical approach the authorities will take. But always, if we are in doubt, again, in line with our duties, we advise clients that, again, our advice is still provided at an early stage. We need to see in practice how authorities end up interpreting that legislation. Because again, at the end of the day, it's more about the years of practice under given legislation that will illustrate to us how the authorities wish to interpret that, not necessarily the initial period of drafting itself. That may change later.
I can see that helping to draft the legislation would give you an edge. The best way to predict the future is to invent the future. Jake, you were going to jump in.
I was just going to say, I think one nice thing about UAE is they look to other jurisdictions for some of their laws. And the nice thing about UAE is a lot of lawyers are from different jurisdictions, particularly a large firm like Tamimi. So there are some directional clues sometimes in new legislation, even though it's not fully implemented. You can look at, for example, the competition law and say, this is clearly picking some things from the EU. We imagine they'll probably do the rest, and the data protection law. So while there's 40 new laws, there's not 40 new concepts. And so I think we're all aware of, this is a flavor in the US, this is in the EU. It might be a mixture of this. These are the type of things that apply to all. You could do easily now.
And just to elaborate on that a little bit, as Jake said, we would then also sometimes look into what other jurisdictions have done with similar regimes. Data protection regime in the DIFC is a good example, because again, it was based on the developments in relation to data protection that were adopted by the European Commission and the European Union member states. And then that was actually a source for many of our practitioners of really interpretation, possible interpretation that could be adopted under DIFC law.
We've recently seen a change to the DIFC, LCIA platform. It just went away. And a lot of companies were just getting comfortable around that particular paraphernalia. And then overnight, almost, we then opening up to the DIAC platform, where the rules were yet to follow. that kind of uncertainty leaves you in a bit of a state of limbo. So that should perhaps be avoided as well.
Can we just to move on and talk about digital transformation, because there's a lot happening in the digital space. Looking at the findings of the report, it did reveal that nearly half, 48% of legal decision makers increased their investment in digital capabilities in 2021 compared to the year before. And Jake, if I can ask you about this specifically from the education sector, because while everyone had big changes in early 2020 when the pandemic hit, few were impacted as much as the education sector, and arguably the world's biggest private schools operator like you, having to implement schooling from home so quickly, but obviously having legal and compliance issues and safeguarding issues when it comes to that. Just talk us through how that happened and what you've learned over the intervening 2 years.
Yeah, certainly an interesting period trying to get 120,000 kids online in sort of 2-week period, and in different jurisdictions, so Egypt and Saudi and Dubai, Abu Dhabi, all these different jurisdictions. So I think that the business was very, very focused on operational and how you can manage. And I mean, you've got very young kids trying to learn online and all that stuff. But it was important for us to also just start kind of see where the risks were in terms of safeguarding and, you know, can you record people and how do you get that consent and how do you make sure that people that are already frustrated with the pandemic and potentially the modality of learning won't be upset about these other potential legal implications. So it was definitely a learning experience that hopefully we don't have to do again. But fortunately, we had really good tech in the schools already. So we really benefited from that, which made our lives a bit easier.
If I could ask a similar question to you, Arturo, in terms of this digital investment. Obviously, you're a technology company first and foremost. So you have that perspective, but you also have the perspective of being the relative newbie on the panel. I think a lot of us have been here quite a while, but you've only been here a few months here in the UAE. So if you can compare what's happening here with other jurisdictions of Mexico, your home country, or anywhere else that you might have worked with.
Of course. I mean, I think the pandemic took a lot of companies by surprise, right? Luckily for us, that was not the case. We're a technology company, right? And we see that, you know, technology is at the center of everything that companies are doing right now. And we see that, you know, some years ago, people used to see technology as a way of cutting costs, right? I don't think that's not the case anymore. Now, companies are scaling their business thanks to technology, right? And the pandemic gave us, you know, the opportunity to see how, you know, we were not really prepared to work on a, you know, remote environment, digital environment. But, you know, after 2.5 years of doing so, you know, we have seen that now companies, you know, do invest in, you know, making sure the data is secure, right? Now everything is moving to the cloud. You have, you know, more cyber attacks. You have disruptions of supply chain. So technology is there to kind of support that. I do think or see that, you know, the adoption of technology in the legal sector is a little bit behind in this region in comparison to other regions I have been, you know, working before. And please take this with a grain of salt because I have been here just for a few months. But for example, in my, you know, my previous jurisdiction, I mean, we use technology both in-house, sometimes, you know, not even developed by us, but to make our life easier, right? To kind of create some sort of solution to get, you know, all of the repetitive answers that were coming to my team that were taking time out of our daily schedules to automate those, right? So created an internal chatbot that was actually answering the, you know, most common questions that come to lawyers within a company. So that will allow my team to focus on more strategic decisions instead of answering every single day, you know, the questions that get posed, like, where is the template? Can I, you know, commit to this sort of liability? You know, what are the powers of attorney that this person has? So, you know, that, you know, type of technology makes, you know, the life of a lawyer easier. We have adopted, you know, specifically in Brazil, which is a highly litigious country in which you manage, you know, thousands of lawsuits in which you have to prepare for hearings, sometimes 50, 60 hearings a month, a very smart system that will allow us to kind of, you know, simply identify the claims that were coming in, the courts they're going to be here at, you know, the percentage of success that we had at those courts, and if it will make more sense for us to settle at the early stage or continue with the litigation.
And are you using things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to refine those judgments?
Combination of artificial intelligence, data processing, and just fine tuning the data that we receive, which with as the times have evolved. I mean, the amount of data we have to receive, read, or collate in a given day has been increasing. So we use the technology to do that. I mean, expense reports, right? How we identify someone is committing violation of internal policies by claiming expense reports that are not due. We use technology to do all of that, and I see in Latin America it's more adopted than what I have seen here so far.
Mona, from your perspective, in terms of your investment in digital technologies, 48% of legal decision makers in this region are increasing their spend on technology. Can you give us some examples of the kind of investments you've made over the past year or two and the kind of impact that it's had on how you do your work as a legal department?
I think, of course, in general, the idea of moving to remote working and all of the tools that you need to be able to do that and have meetings online, I think that was the immediate focus initially, if we just look at the last couple of years. But to Arturo's point, in terms of chatbots, I think one of the more exciting developments is within the legal function specifically, developing a chatbot named Lawrence, who's an owl, who is meant to advise the business or guide the business on certain things that they may need to know in terms of the corporate standards. So commitment authorization levels, questions, basic questions in relation to compliance areas like antitrust, etc., and helps guide the business to those particular corporate standards. Of course, anything beyond that that's more in depth, more involved, won't replace the actual legal support that's there. But it does give us time to focus more on strategic partnering to the business, and it's certainly a start. I can see it continuing to evolve with time.
Fawzia, if I can ask you how you approached working from home. There are few industries that are as tightly regulated as financial services, and I'm sure that within all the city offices here in the UAE and around the globe, you've got bulletproof firewalls to help keep everything secure. And yet suddenly within 3 weeks, you've got everyone working from home on home Wi-Fi, which has very low levels of security. How on earth did you manage that? And to what extent did you work with the technology department or the IT department or the digital department, call it what you will, to try and make this work and keep your clients' data secure?
So from our end, we were following the global model that we have in place, which is allowing employees to work at least 1 day a week from home, even before the pandemic hit us. So we were quite ready in terms of embracing the working from home almost overnight on a full-time basis. So my team wasn't as sort of handicapped in terms of crossing over. The firewalls or whatever they do to keep our data secure, etc., was still in place. We have a pretty good technology around that, I would like to think. And I think for me, the challenge was more around keeping the team together in terms of breaking silos. So when, and I'm pretty old school in that way, and I need to change that, I accept. So from being able to walk the floor and speak to somebody and have a chat, etc., and pull people together to have a discussion, we were now on boxes on a screen, windows, and sort of somebody would put their camera off, somebody would put their camera on, and is it right to ask somebody to keep their cameras on because you want to see their faces and remember what they look like? Or is it wrong to do that? All of that was a bit of a mindset shift. But I think we're beyond that now. I think people are very, very comfortable in working from home and being able to switch. In fact, it's brought a lot of value in terms of being able to prove that working from home or working from work is pretty much the same. You're still as productive either ways. So from our end, the tech investment has always been also towards the client experience. So digitization for us is huge. Innovation for us on that front is huge. Clients ask for that. So they don't want to come into the offices to give across attested copies of board resolutions or what have you. They want to send it via email or scan those through. So what's the safest way to be able to ensure that that is in a form which is recognized should something go wrong? How authentic is it? Who do you use to be able to authenticate that? Do you use digital certification service providers that are recognized in the UAE and elsewhere for that purpose? And yes, we've had to cross that bridge as well. But then all of this advancement that's happening on the tech front needs to also be supported by the various court systems that are in place, because you'll all recognize that MENA is widely a civil law jurisdiction. So there is no doctrine of binding precedent. So there's no case law per se to rely on, right? So you just have to rely on, again, experiences of different regulators, experiences of different regimes, so to speak, right? So you turn towards law firms as well to ask for that. And then again, you might not get a clean opinion on that. They might say, listen, this seems to be working, it should be working, but let's just wait and see, it's still untested.
So Isabella, from the perspective of Al Tamimi, a leading law firm in this region, a 2 or 3 part question, if you'll forgive me. First of all, where are you guys spending your digital dollars, or where have you been over the past couple of years? What have you found that works? And secondly, because again, these guys here, they want to know that their data is secure, that any conversation they have with you is absolutely secure, that any information they give you is rock solid, secure. And how do you go about managing that? And the third part is, anything else that's sprung to mind over the past 2 years that I haven't thought of?
When it comes to technology, we have actually, we've been very proactive, I'm happy to say. And in fact, we introduced the working from home capability a few months before COVID pandemic hit the world. That was coincidental, of course, you know, in a way, but that allowed us to work from home from day one, essentially. All of our lawyers got equipped in laptops and were able to access the platform. However, and I believe this is really where the core of your question, Richard, is. We needed throughout time to upgrade our security systems of the client data that we were receiving. Also, we purchased and we installed software that would allow us to receive, while working from home, sizable attachments and emails that were pretty heavy. As you can imagine, we receive a number of really thick documents, you know, via network, sometimes in really comparable formats that make those attachments even heavier on the system. So we wanted to make sure that working from home doesn't slow down our responsiveness. And of course, the third layer to what we did was our information technology team worked very closely with our data digital team, with our expert lawyers in the field of data digital, to see again what requirements on protecting data there are, but we also improved and acquired more software to protect sensitive data of clients, to make sure that really there isn't any breach of client confidentiality. Maybe to a disappointment of some of our lawyers initially, what that meant was that we had to really make sure that lawyers don't open their personal email boxes through the system of the law firm, don't download software without authorization by the information technology team, precisely to make sure that, first of all, there isn't a virus that we would invite into the system, but also that in whatever capacity the network is accessed by our lawyers and network of the law firm and documentation and information of our clients, which is really the prime importance to us, gets verified by the information technology team to make sure that it's a safe way to open the file that is a bizarrely looking file, for example, or a software that we think looks very, very innocent, that potentially could give access for a third party to actually breach the security of our law firm.
And in terms of technology that actually helps you do your job, the services and the judgments that these guys are essentially hiring firms like your firm. And Arturo touched on this, the machine learning, the artificial intelligence, that isn't just an enabling technology like video conferencing or data storage, but is actually doing the job of a lawyer and helping to make decisions. Are we there yet? Are we not there yet? Will we ever get there? Or will we always need lawyers like you guys actually making those judgments? Can AI and machine learning ever replace you guys?
Well, the artificial intelligence and the machine learning is very unlikely to replace us, legal practitioners, and that's very good news. There was a point in time when I would say, yes, absolutely right.
Even the guy from IBM agrees.
Yes,
yeah.
Completely right. But there was, of course, a period of time when I think in the legal profession, being historically and even today quite a conservative profession, right? We are naturally resistant to change, I think, as lawyers. But technology is unlikely to replace us. However, we have realized over the years we need technology to help us be more efficient and to also help us be more accurate, because any type of a smallest oversight in client matters, in documentation, negotiation, any type of discussions may have really very serious negative implications on the business of our client. And what we've done then to approach that technology that is available, that has been tested by law firms internationally, is we have brought software we've tested. First of all, we've tested a number of different softwares. We've had teams allocated to different softwares. We ran a number of pilot programs with the use of softwares. And those programs allowed us to identify the softwares that we would find actually useful. Interestingly enough, different practices found different softwares useful. So for example, we've got a software that would help with the discovery process carried out by our litigation team, right? Especially for DIFC courts and international litigation, because the software is targeted towards English language proceedings, much more than Arabic still, but that is already there, helping the litigation team. That said, our litigation team really is the largest team we've got in the firm. So again, lawyers still are required to do the fine-tuning, to brainstorm the outcome of that artificial intelligence product. On the non-litigious side of things, we have been using software that helps us draft contracts, and that makes some of the contract suites of documentation really more efficient for us to put together, and also software that would help us really check cross-referencing across huge suites of documentation. But again, at the end of the day, when the artificial intelligence machinery has done its job, then it's still us lawyers who sit down, do a cross-check, and then we're comfortable, and then the product goes out to the client.
Let's move on to in some senses it's the final topic, but in others it's the first topic, because the key finding, the number one finding from this report, was legal enters the boardroom. And there's many statistics, but let me just read one at you. 60% of legal decision makers have a seat on the board or equivalent, and now routinely advise the board, not just on legal matters, but on business strategy. Mona, you've spent some of your life or career in private practice, but a lot of it recently in-house. To what extent does that reflect your reality, that you're now in the boardroom and being asked to advise not just on legal rulings, but on business strategy?
Absolutely, 100%. I think, and this has evolved over the years as well, where we've gone from being seen as business blockers within an organization, and I say that as the legal function in general, to being viewed as business enablers. And so the idea is that we are positioned now to really partner the business very intimately, be an integral part of the business. That's who we are. So it's not just legal, it's we are part of the business. And at the management level, we also, in that respect, have to view ourselves as leaders in the business. So not just the legal expert, but also leaders in the business and supporting the business in assessing risks, in strategizing from the get-go, preemptively, and not just on strictly legal topics. We need to view ourselves as in that capacity as leaders in the business to also advise on other non-legal topics or give our views maybe more from a commercial perspective, for example, in addition to a strictly legal perspective. So it certainly has evolved tremendously in that respect. And I think that's the way of the future. Things like contracts and the more transactional work, that's part of it, but that's not really, yes, we add value there, but where we add true value and more tremendous value is more in the advising across various areas from a strategic perspective.
Jake, if I can ask you, have you seen this kind of mission creep as well, from being the legal advisor to being a trusted advisor on a more broad range of issues? And if so, maybe you can give us a couple of examples from GEMS or from the education sector.
Yeah, I would agree with what Mona said. I think, despite what some people think, lawyers are good thinkers. They are good at grasping difficult concepts. And I think some of the problems where in the past we say business blockers is they've been so focused on risk and being right and not being challenged. And sort of if you're a hammer, every problem's a nail. But when you redirect that thinking towards solving the business's problems, of which one aspect is the legal aspect, in which you have good training you bring to bear, I think people want that thinking and they're sort of hungry for it. So yeah, I see it quite often.
Maybe give me some examples of the kind of things you've been asked to advise on from a business strategy perspective. I know there are compliance issues and you can't give me too much detail, but is there anything that you could share in terms of you being in the boardroom and talking about things that aren't legal issues?
Yeah, I would say I see, particularly on M&A and corporate matters, that those things are very complicated. I think there's issues where you have some people on the finance side and some people on the legal side, and they don't understand each other, what they're each working on. And I think if someone on the finance side is good at reading the document and someone on the legal side is good with the numbers, that's a super valuable asset. And so I've seen that a lot, where if you can understand the financial aspects and say, look, this is really risky from a legal perspective, but there's this other alternative from a legal perspective that limits that risk, but I think substantively solves what you're trying to do. I think in some of those more big, chunky, complicated M&A type deals, I've seen that.
Fozia, what's been your experience working for a very large multinational organization, a listed company, multiple layers of compliance? How have you seen your role and the role of in-house counsel transition from being purely advising on legal matters to being something a little bit broader?
Us in the boardroom, insofar as having the role of a consultant in advising, that's all fine, and a lot of us do the roles of company secretaries as well. But to have more vocal existence where you have a vote on matters that a member of your team would have advised on, I think that could potentially pose a conflict of interest. So we shy away within Citi from being members of boards, so we don't do that. Or if we are doing that, we we restrict it to a concern where a person on the board is not also heading the team in that particular jurisdiction. So it's just to keep that arm's length situation going.
It's an interesting perspective, Arturo. Again, very large, multinational, listed company, lots of levels of compliance. Where does your role as counsel end and your role as advisor, businessman, if you like, begin?
Yeah, I think you touched on a very good point. I mean, I think we're considered businessmen now. I mean, and I, like Fauci, I mean, I agree with that position. I do not sit as a former member of the board of the company. I don't allow, to the extent I can, to my team members to sit on the board. We do enter the boardroom, right? We are sitting next to the general manager, next to the business leaders to help them make those decisions. I mean, we are the trusted advisors, right? And some of the things that I have been practicing since I moved into private practice, the way I always see things is you go to the experts in Altamimi to give you a deep analysis of what the law provides, of what the risks are, but it's up to you then to execute. You know, the in-house counsel has to eventually make the decision. Do I agree with what Altamimi is saying? But if I completely go with what they're saying, the business may not close. So I need to make that decision, informed judgment, and again, you get the stakeholders. You see, you know, as Jake mentioned, I mean, this may be risky, but if we have cover on this one, I mean, this may still be a good business for the company. So as a team, you take that informed decision. We are basically cost centers, right? I mean, we don't generate actual revenue for companies. So what, you know, I always try to teach my team is you cannot come back to your clients and say no. I mean, unless it's borderline illegal, because we will never cross that line, just find a solution how to do it. There's probably going to be more than one solution to a single problem. So if you're faced with this, you may not like it, yeah? You may feel uncomfortable because this is risky, but that doesn't mean it's illegal. So make sure you lay out all the risks that you see and make that, or help the business do that informed decision.
And it's interesting, it comes back to what you said. You've moved away from being this cliche of lawyers are the business blockers within the organization to people facilitating business. And yet, as Arturo said, sometimes you do have to say no, don't you, I guess?
Absolutely, 100%. I think, you know, I agree with both what Fawzia and Arturo said, and I think it's just important to make that distinction between the corporate board and the leadership team for the business. So legal's presence is more on the leadership team for the business. And yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, there will always be times when you have to draw a hard line to say, it's very clear, you can do this, you cannot do this. I think where our role has changed over the years and will continue to change is that perhaps in the past it used to be that legal would just say, no, you can't do this. And then they go back to their office, you know, to their silo, and the business goes to try to figure out, okay, well, what alternatives can we come up with in terms of certain projects or deals. Whereas now legal is more involved with that ongoing discussion among the business. So it's, no, you can't do this, but let's see what you can do that would would provide the business with a competitive edge, but still keep you in compliance with the local laws and any other rules and regulations that you have to be compliant in. So it's a more proactive, ongoing discussion, as opposed to in the past where it might have been that legal just says no, and then that's the end of that discussion until the business approaches again.
And finally, Isabella, if I can ask you about how this has changed from the perspective of a lawyer in a private practice who's advising firms like this. To what extent have you seen a change in the type of people that you're advising? I've got this image maybe 10, 15 years ago, you would have mainly been advising the legal counsel in firms like this, but maybe now you're more called in to speak to the CFO or the CEO or the Chief Strategy Officer. I have this sense in my head that maybe that transition is happening, but maybe not. How accurate is that?
There is a transition happening indeed, because at the end of the day, really whatever changes are happening within the business, and the fact that businesses, even without including their in-house legal team formally as board members, they talk more to the in-house legal teams in relation to commercial matters. That directly means that we get approached very often by the chief finance officers, by the chief executive officers, by, in general, by those who lead the commercial side of the business. And then, of course, it's quite an interesting discussion, because we at times do need the in-house team to be the bridge between the business side of things and us coming from the legal side. But one thing that naturally came to mind when all of us were discussing this matter was that, in fact, because of those changes that are happening within organizations themselves and more expectation on in-house legal teams to have a commercial thinking about risk and approach to risk and assessment, means that Clients expect us as law firms to advise them on the risk, to tell them what the legal position is, but also to come up with solutions and to see, to even do a little bit of that brainstorming and risk assessment. Every now and again, we as lawyers in-house push back on that a little bit. We say, it's difficult for us to assess the risk for you. You as an organization know what is more important to you. We can give you a little bit of pros and cons, but over the years, we have, as a legal profession, become more practical in the approach. Sometimes, instead of producing lengthy, detailed memos, we would say to the client, would you like a suite of PowerPoint slides that may help you at the meeting with your management? So our practice, private practice, has evolved in order to meet the changing expectations of the corporate world of our clients.
And that's interesting, and it brings me on to my next question. You mentioned PowerPoint slides, which immediately conjures up images of management consultants or strategy consultants. And for all the large organizations like we have here today, they will have a legal advisor. They'll also have an accountancy firm advising them. They'll probably have some kind of management or strategy consultancy. They'll probably have some kind of communications or investor relations consultancy, and maybe one or two others. And I wonder, to use that phrase again, mission creep. Do you find there's any mission creep or bleed between those worlds, and that you're getting drawn into a little bit of investor relations because of legal aspects to that, a little bit of human resources because there's a legal aspect to that?
Yes, in fact, to some extent. Of course, not largely, because still, although there is a huge world of professional services and strategy firms and financial advisory vehicles and us law firms, but there is a little bit of that, first of all, overlap where a business would discuss a strategy issue with us, but again, then those discussions tend to be limited to really local opposition in relation to a given topic. That said, we every now and again, jointly with other advisors, meet together, have calls together in relation to a project for a specific client. There has been much more, I think, communication between law firms, strategy firms, and even auditors or accounting firms working for a given business in relation to a specific client than years ago when I started to practice law. Because all of us, we know that at the end of the day, we are there to serve the same purpose, the same client, and the better we communicate as professionals, then the better the overall outcome will be for the business.
Well, I'm going to wrap up now by asking each of you just for one final concluding thought, if I may. Of course, this is the first law firm in the Middle East and North Africa with a regular survey-based publication, Legal Leaders in MENA. 700 people have been surveyed in this. And just to throw the spotlight forward, or maybe get out the crystal ball, we've looked at the top 7 issues presented in this report, but I'm interested in the questions you're being asked, either internally or externally, and what you think some of the future legal issues that are going to be in future reports might be. Arturo, first of all for you, what are the 2023, 2024 issues that are emerging on the horizon?
I mean, I'm going to take this from the technology side of things. I mean, I think we're seeing cybersecurity as a big threat, right? And again, as lawyers, I think handling of data, right, from our employees, clients, and the ethics of doing business, with the embedding of artificial intelligence and the like. I think the way we conduct business in the future is going to be essential. And one of the 3 pillars of IBM ESG report circles around the ethics of doing business. I think that's what's in stake for the horizon, limit to the legal profession here in the region.
Mona, from your perspective inside Henkel, what are these future emerging issues, the ones where you think, I'm getting more and more questions on this, this might be important going forward?
Yeah, I agree with Arturo. I think issues of data protection and privacy will continue to evolve, especially in the region as we get more and more legislation in that area. And given the change in dynamics of people's moving to remote working, this will become a more important topic for us to tackle, as well as just in general looking at things from a cross-jurisdictional perspective. So it's no longer that when we look at a situation or we're faced with an issue, it's what are the rules and regulations within that particular country. But given that people are more mobile now, parties in different countries are going to be engaging more and more, so we have to look at things from a multi-jurisdictional perspective, definitely. And of course, ESG, that will continue to move forward in terms of level of importance. And I think for those that have not quite grasped that yet, they may be, falling behind. So that will continue to be a very important topic.
Fawzia, from your perspective, if you look over the horizon 1 or 2 or 3 years hence, what do you think is going to be the big issue that you're going to be asked about?
All of these that they've mentioned thus far, and certainly also localization, increase elements around those, data protection. So regulators wanting to keep data that belongs to their customers in a jurisdiction, in that jurisdiction, and not being, warehoused elsewhere. Or at least being reluctant to having it being warehoused elsewhere. ESG for sure. From our end also as Citi, a lot of focus has moved towards the client experience. So how do we, as a legal team, make it easier to onboard clients? How do we make KYC, relevant? And how do we make it easier for the client to understand our documentation? I think that's going to be key.
Jake, from your perspective, what do you see as the next big thing?
Yeah, I agree with all that, of course. I think, we want to talk about ESG. I think we're just getting started there. I guess one that we haven't touched on would be tax. So tax substance, global minimum tax. We've all looked at tax structure reports that are going to be completely unwound, and we all have existing structures. I think it's going to be super complicated, and unlike some things that the regulations are out there but are not enforced, I can promise you that tax that will be enforced because it hits the bottom line.
Finally, Isabella, our host today, thank you very much indeed. Again, if you look forward 2 or 3 years, what are the emerging legal issues that you think are going to be keeping your team and teams like yours busy?
Well, I think there will be a general trend that will continue of legislation popping out left, right, and center with a lot of changes. I think really across different areas of operation. We were looking at 40 new pieces of legislation over the past year in the UAE. That trend, in my view, will continue. It will continue and it may increase. For us in private practice, it will mean we will have to continue to be up to speed with those changes to meet our clients' expectations. And again, it's will be very exciting. Those coming years look very positive and exciting because the economies of the region are booming and the authorities are really continuing to modify legislation to address those changes.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could go on for hours, but we'll have to leave it there. Thanks to our panelists today. First of all, you just heard from Isabella Saskowska, the partner with Al-Tamimi. Thank you very much indeed for your time. To my right, we have Mona Mahdi from Henkel Jebel Ali, Legal Director, Head of Legal and Compliance. Appreciate your time today. Thank you very much indeed. Arturo, new to the region. Great to have you here. Thanks very much indeed. Arturo Ortiz de Zarate, General Counsel for this region for IBM. Thanks very much indeed for your time. To Jake Barnard, General Counsel with GEMS Education. It's been great. Thank you very much indeed. And finally, to Fawzia Kehar, Division Counsel for the Middle East and North Africa at Citibank. Appreciate your time today. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that concludes our discussion today. We could, of course, go on for hours, but we'll have to leave it there. From Al-Tamimi headquarters here in Dubai, thanks very much indeed for your time and attention today. Don't forget, of course, the report is out. Legal leaders in MENA, 700 legal decision makers giving their opinions on some of the big issues that matter. Thank you very much.